I thank the gentlelady. Director Cohen, can you name 3 things that you would do differently from the former director of the CDC?
Thank you so much for that question. As I was sharing earlier, I led the COVID response for North Carolina, and I think the lessons that I bring from that are 3 of them. One, a focus on transparency. I think transparency is really important to build trust. I think sharing what you know when you know it, and also what you don't know. I hope you see that already under my tenure and how we're communicating differently. So that is one. Second is a focus on operational excellence. We can't just recommend a vaccine. We have to make sure that we're making access possible for folks. We need to marry the evidence with the operations. We are an operation response agency as well. So that's number 2. And then the third is about relationships. It's really important that we are working as one team. We have to build relationships before a crisis hits so that when we get into those crisis, we can make sure to use those. Sometimes public health finds themselves siloed away from the traditional healthcare system. I think it's really important that we bring healthcare and public health closer together.
Well, if the CDC had a sales department, those would all be fine. I'm talking more about actual policy and specifically, would you have shut down the schools? Would you have closed the schools? Is that what you did in North Carolina?
Well, sir, yes, back in 2020, all the schools across the entire country were shut down, including North Carolina. But I did work across the aisle with...
Would you shut them down? Had you been in charge, would you have shut down the schools if this were to happen again, if we had another major respiratory outbreak? Would you shut down the schools?
Well, the good news is we're in a different place than we were before. We both have different tools and different mechanisms to respond. So I can't really address a hypothetical, but I do think we've learned a lot about how to approach things.
Did it harm our students by shutting down the schools?
Well, look, we always knew in-person instruction was incredibly beneficial, not just for
You'd be great in the sales department. But I'm trying to get to policy, and that's one of the key things that troubles us about the CDC, is we have to address policy. You know, there's a saying that if you're explaining, you're losing. So we need to get down to policy. We need to talk about the things that went wrong and what we need to do. Masking. You know, you keep... the CDC insisted on masking kids as young as 2 years old and made the argument that there was no disagreement. I think the word is equipoise. I have a study here that clearly shows that there was widespread disagreement in Europe, even here. Yet the CDC insisted on masking kids as young as 2 years old. What would be your position on that?
Well, I would say it's good that we're in a different place and we're able to turn a chapter forward. We have a lot of different tools to protect our children now, vaccines and treatment. Masks continue to be one tool amongst many that we can use to protect ourselves.
So you would continue to require masking for 2-year-old kids?
So, again, we are in a very different place.
I know that, but I'm asking you, this is a policy question. There have been no randomized control trials on masking. And I can't help but think that the CDC didn't want the randomized control trials because it didn't fit the narrative, didn't fit the position they wanted to take. And there's a lot of people, I mean a lot of people, that felt like this was more about power than it was medicine. And if you're going to continue to try to do a sales job, you want to continue to try to explain positions, it's going to be difficult to get us on board with the CDC because people don't trust you anymore. And there's been enormous damage done to science and medicine by the policy of the CDC and the National Institutes for Health and others, Dr. Fauci being the lead candidate for disinformation. So you can continue to come in and do a sales job. You can try to explain. But if there aren't significant policy changes, I think it's going to be very difficult going forward. I yield back.
Thank you. And now I call on Representative Crenshaw for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Dr. Cohen, for being here. I echo what my friend Mr. Palmer said. If the CDC wants its credibility back, you've got to have a mea culpa moment. You're in the perfect position to do it because you had nothing to do with their decisions at the time. So there's no reason to defend it. The data is the data. The data is very clear now. You can blame it on hindsight. You can blame it on, we didn't know as much as we know now at the time. You can do all sorts of things, but you can tell the truth, and then the public will start trusting the CDC again. You can say, it's okay to say, it didn't make any sense to shut down schools. The data shows that now. Didn't make any sense to do major lockdowns. The data shows that now. Doesn't make sense to mask kids. Data shows that now. It's okay to say it. And the public will reward you for it, because it's pretty dangerous thinking about the future when maybe we do have a disease that spreads through America that has a 50% kill rate of 8-year-olds. Then you better mask up. Then you better really start thinking about things. But you know what? They're not going to trust you because you refuse to even say that you were wrong. And you weren't even wrong, so you might as well just say that others were wrong. That's just some advice, unsolicited. I have major questions. I can read a long list of agencies that kind of seem to do the same thing. BARDA, ASPRS, CDC, there's like a defense bio something, NIH. There's a lot of overlap here. I mean, what is the difference between ASPRS and CDC?
Well, thank you, Representative Crenshaw. So CDC does provide the scientific evidence and technical expertise, particularly related to infectious disease and other health threats. ASPR provides emergency response, so I would say, to any kind of threat, a hurricane to an infectious disease threat. So they can bring in resources, whether it's people or stockpile resources, but it's really CDC and that technical expertise that decides, well, where do you deploy it, how, for what purpose? So it's a partnership. You can't have one without the other, and we do work very, very closely together to make sure that we're coordinated.
It seems like a lot of overlap, and there's a ton of academic research that happens at CDC, and I think we have real questions. And the CDC has never been authorized. That's another fun fact. But that academic research also happens at NIH. It's very duplicative. How do we justify that?
So I do think that they are separate types of portfolios. NIH is doing evidence generation. The kind of work that CDC is doing is detection. Are we detecting threats and then responding to them and understanding what best practices work to make sure that we are keeping folks healthy? So that is the work that we are focused on in CDC and in public health. Again, NIH, incredibly important research portfolio. But
and I appreciate your intent to create a more operational CDC, but because it's not there right now. We have really no biodetection system. I know you want more of it. I know we talked about wastewater in our previous conversations, and that's all good. I like that a lot, but I do have more questions. I know Mr. Griffith asked about this, but there was a hidden biolab out in California. Reedley, California, local officials discovered the Chinese national was running an illegal biolab with 1,000 transgenic mice modified to be similar to humans, infected with nasty stuff like dengue, COVID, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis. Won't get into a ton of details here. I think the main problem here is why did it take so long to actually respond to that lab and for the CDC to go test it? The American public believes in their minds, like, this is exactly what the CDC is for. Locals can't deal with it. The state is the Health and Human Services of California is asking CDC to do it. What was the timeline from that ask to actual response?
Well, thank you so much. I was able to share some information earlier that there were a number of inaccuracies in the report that was put together from this. Again, state and local authorities are, as you were saying, are in charge, as well as FBI, FDA. CDC's role was to come in and do an investigation related to select agents. When we were invited and asked to do that, we did respond. We sent a team. They were there for 2.5 days, did an extensive review. What we found was no evidence of select agents. And really, what what was compelling as I reviewed that information was it wasn't that they didn't have any equipment that would have allowed folks to work with select agents. So not only do we see the freezers and the paper.
How long did it take from the request for CDC to actually come? Because I thought it took a congressperson from California to get CDC there.
My understanding is that when we were asked, we deployed.
Okay, select agents, very specific. I'm under the understanding that if a vial of something is not labeled, that you don't test it.
So we do have limited authority in some of this space, but what we did was go on premises, again, do a 2.5-day investigation. We did not see any evidence of select agents at this lab.
Using words very carefully, and I'm out of time, but you need to tell us what law that is. So if it says Gatorade on it, and you're like, I mean, it could be Ebola, could be Gatorade. It says Gatorade, just don't test it. The law says don't test it. I have a hard time believing the law says that.
Well, so I want you to know.
But I'm out of time. But if the chairwoman will let me keep going, I'm happy to.
Well,
That's your answer.